Hello everyone. I hope you're all doing very well, and I hope you had enjoyed the snow outside a little bit. In the video lectures of week 4, we're going to be addressing the beginnings of urbanization and the invention of writing in southern Mesopotamia. Last week, as you will recall, we looked at the Neolithic site of Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük in the lectures. And the first one, Göbekli Tepe, if you recall, is a seasonal mountain sanctuary that was used by the hunter-gatherer communities in the region for feasting, for getting together on a kind of a really seasonal basis. And this is located in southeastern Turkey. Where we saw a lot of animal symbolism carved on the T-shaped pillars that we talked about. On the other hand, Çatalhöyük, this large permanent settlement on the right, which was mainly inhabited by agriculturalists who had domesticated both plants and animals by the time. And so you can also see the time difference between them. Göbekli Tepe is inhabited from 9600 BC to 7300 BCE, and Çatalhöyük is a lot later, from 7500 to 6300 BCE. So we're looking at the early Neolithic versus really the later Neolithic at Çatalhöyük. And in Çatalhöyük we saw a lot of continuities with this kind of animal symbolism, but also a changing, sort of really very house-based culture. And the excavations at both of these sites are very, very famous, and they really radically changed what we know about the Neolithic period in the Middle East in general. So this week, what we will be doing is going forward in time and looking at the next episode in the late Neolithic and the Chalcolithic period to talk about the formation of some of the regional identities. And these Neolithic sites were really kind of isolated and sort of really living in their own world. But by the end of the Chalcolithic, what we see is these kind of regional formations, regional alliances and associations are forming. So we're going to study what are those regional associations, what are those regional identities emerging in the material culture of the Middle East. So let's look at some of the objectives and the video content of this week. We're going to start with in this video, we're going to start with looking at the landscapes of West Asia. Before we go into these kind of different regional cultures, we really need to talk a little bit about the diverse landscapes that that Middle East offers to human communities, addressing different kinds of ecological conditions and how those communities actually adapted to them, what kind of different lifestyles associated with them. And I will also touch on, at the very end of this lecture, to touch on sort of how environmental sciences is now collaborating with archaeology and what kind of information they offer to us in the study of the ancient world. Secondly, in the second lecture, we're going to really investigate these regional cultures of the late Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods, characterized by their material culture. Especially, we're going to talk about ceramic traditions, pottery, what kind of pots these people had in their homes, and how they created these regional alliances by means of the pottery, the ceramics that they were also using. And so that's what we will do in the next video, in the second video. Third, we're going to turn our attention to southern Mesopotamia, to the city of Uruk, and we will talk about the beginnings of urbanization. What is urbanization? What is the urban revolution? And we're going to study Uruk as a ceremonial urban center. While doing this, actually, we're interested also how sort of monumental architecture really adapted to this kind of new idea of living in a city, right? And fourth and final video is going to be about narrative, performance, and visual culture at Uruk, looking at how sort of the emergence of pictorial representation as well as verbal representation, as well as writing, the invention of writing contributed to that kind of urban community and how they lived their lives. There's a really interesting tradition of storytelling in pictures emerge really precisely at the moment when Uruk becomes a city, the center of a ceremonial center. And there's a really interesting relationship between what happens in visual art and what happens in this kind of changing economy from a rural to an urban life. So we're going to really discuss that together. First, I'd like to speak about these diversity of Near Eastern landscapes with you, talk about this and different kinds of ecological adaptations. You know, the Middle East offers such a variety of landscapes, from the Mediterranean all the way to the mountains of Iran, to the mountains of Transcaucasus, and the lowlands and the alluvial plains of Mesopotamia. And so each of these actually offer variety of microenvironments, microecologies, so to speak, regions with different topographies, different vegetation, and therefore really opening the doors, giving opportunities for different cultural formations, actually. So we're going to study those variety of landscapes. Let's start actually with the Lower Mesopotamia. So one of the really distinctive places in the next couple of weeks, actually, studying the Chalcolithic and the Bronze Age, early Bronze Age, we're going to be looking at urbanization in Lower Mesopotamia, which is really fascinating because in all of the Middle East, that's where the first cities emerged. Why is this? And by Lower Mesopotamia, we're actually talking about the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that flow through the Mesopotamian lower plains. And as they flow, these two rivers bring alluvial soils from the mountains of Anatolia and Iran and bring them and deposit them into this flatland. And of course, this actually makes a very rich, agriculturally rich landscape, very prolific landscape in Mesopotamia. But this is also a region that actually lacks enough rainfall, so you are really dependent on irrigating your fields in order to have crops. So this is an area of irrigated agriculture, as we will talk about it. And then we have the Fertile Crescent, as we, quote-unquote, Fertile Crescent, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, which is this area of northern Mesopotamia, this kind of really foothills that border the Mesopotamian alluvial plain, plus the Levantine coast, right? And this is the area where we saw the beginnings of the Neolithic most powerfully. And these are rolling hill landscapes with lots of water, lots of really great springs, and also it really covered mostly northern Mesopotamia with a kind of an oak pistachio forest. So these are the first immediate sources of wood, for example, for the Mesopotamians in later time periods. And then we have the Levant and the Mediterranean coastline. The Levantine coast today is Lebanon, sort of western Syria, Israel, Palestine, as well as the delta region of Egypt. If we think of that kind of Mediterranean coast, that has a very distinctive Mediterranean climate and very distinctive Mediterranean sort of landscape of olive orchards, olives, and vineyards, as well as we will see cedar forests. And cedar forests really cluster in the northwestern part of Syria, closer to Turkey, also the Turkish coast. And we will see that cedar is a very important building wood, is going to be an incredible, important resource for Mesopotamians to go and get. And so we'll read that in the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, who goes to the cedar forest for cutting cedar trees, right? And so and then the high plateaus of Anatolia and Iran and Transcaucasus, which are very rich in these kind of, both in terms of water, but also very important for pastoralism, very different climate than actually the Mediterranean or the Mesopotamian plain, with lots of fruit orchards, but some really high mountainous regions, really fantastic for both grain agriculture, rain-fed agriculture. So these areas are actually have enough rainfall that you can actually rely on cultivation based on just rainfall instead of irrigation. So that means that's a very different kind of landscape. We're really talking about supplied with sort of really higher elevations of fruit orchards as well. We're talking about apricots, cherries, apples, particularly central Anatolia, very, very good landscape for apples and pears, for example. So, so we're going to study some of that as well. The Black Sea Basin, all the way to the north, is a little different. It's sort of like the Pacific Northwest of United States, like Oregon, Seattle, Washington, that area, which is sort of high rainfall with rainforests and different kinds of crops. The Black Sea used to be a brackish lake in antiquity, particularly. And from the Bronze Age onwards, it got connected by geological events. It got connected to the Mediterranean. So we're seeing a very different sort of environment in the Black Sea region. The Syro-Arab desert landscapes, then any area that actually between the Mesopotamian alluvial plain in Iraq and the Mediterranean coast, we have this Syrian desert, right? This was a major problem in how do you cross the Syrian desert to go to the Mediterranean. You didn't. In the absence of camels, when you don't have a camel. And camels actually came very late to the Mediterranean, to the Mesopotamian sort of life, to the Near Eastern life. It came in the Iron Age. So before camels, you couldn't really not imagine crossing the desert. And so what you did was actually follow the river courses. You used the river as an artery of communication, artery of transportation to go all the way up to Syria and the Mediterranean. You would never cross the desert. And that changed actually with the introduction of camel, which we will see in the Iron Age. So here it is. So we are, you will notice then that a lot of the earliest sort of prosperous Bronze Age cities emerge in the lower Mesopotamia, in the Mesopotamian alluvium in southern Iraq. So we're going to spend a couple of weeks in week 5, 6 to actually study those cities and the earliest civilization. Why is this? This is going to be a major discussion for us in the coming weeks. But this map is important. I've shown you this map before. It's the yellow line, the yellow edge that you see is the 200 millimeter annual rainfall line. Why is this important? It's important because if you receive below 200 millimeters per year, that means that you cannot do agriculture just based on rainfall. You have to irrigate your fields. If you're growing grains, if you're growing anything, you have to irrigate your fields. And that's Mesopotamia. You can see it's all in the blue. Whereas up in Anatolia, in Iran, in northern Mesopotamia, about the 200 millimeter line, you can rely on irrigated, or you can rely on rain-fed agriculture. You can rely on rainfall for cultivating your crops. And so you can see that speckled area that we have is the distribution of wild barley and wheat. And so that's actually the area where the wild species of barley and wheat existed in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, in antiquity. So that's the place where this kind of Neolithic revolution, the domestication of plants, took place. That's why you don't actually find those very early Neolithic sites in Mesopotamia. That's not where these plants were. It's in the Levant. It's in that kind of Fertile Crescent zone. So the Euphrates River, if we come to the Euphrates River, this is a very important sort of actor in the history of Mesopotamia, because this is a really important resource, not only for irrigating your fields, but also for navigation. The Mesopotamians really traveled up and down, north and south, through the Euphrates River. The important thing about Euphrates is that it is born. Its sources are in the eastern Turkey, on the mountains of eastern Turkey, and they flow through Syria, Turkey, Syria, and then into Iraq, and then join the Tigris River and flow into the Persian Gulf. And so it's a slow-moving river. It's a shallow river. That's why it's actually very different than Tigris. Euphrates is wide and shallow and slow-moving river, whereas Tigris River has a deep valley. It moves fast, and therefore it has a very different. It's hard to navigate. Whereas it's much easier to navigate the Euphrates River because it's wide and shallow and slow moving, right? And so, but both rivers carry these immense amounts of alluvial soils and deposit them on their edges. And when they are actually down in the Mesopotamian plain, it's very easy for them to spread this. This is, of course, stopped in the last 50-60 years because of the construction of multiple hydroelectric dams along these two rivers, particularly the Euphrates. And the archaeological work along these rivers has actually shown us that because, especially Euphrates, because it's such a shallow, slow-moving river, it actually moved a lot. So these rivers actually change, especially Euphrates River, changed or shifted its course through time, which meant that the settlements shifted with them as well. And so archaeological work on the movement of these rivers actually has shown that there are some kind of really relic, sort of relic waterways where the old canals of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, and the settlements that were actually set up in the vicinity of these rivers. If the river actually shifts its course to, let's say, a few kilometers eastwards, then it becomes really untenable to live in that site. And so those places would be abandoned. And here's an example of a site, the site of Eridu, which looks very desolate in the bottom. Actually, ironically, Eridu was one of the sort of first cities in Mesopotamia which was dedicated to the god of fresh water, Enki. And it was really a site, it was a place which was in this marshy, watery landscape. And look what it looks like today, because the river has moved, right? And so the river went elsewhere. As we move to the south, actually, we start to come across these very watery, marshy landscapes of southern Mesopotamia, which was also at one point drained by Saddam Hussein, and now sort of some environmental rehabilitation is taking place these days. This landscape was very abundant in reed cultivation, reeds and palm trees everywhere. And the most important architectural material for this was, of course, these reeds. And you can see on the left these reed mats that were woven from reed and used to build houses, to build spaces. And this landscape actually features buildings known as the Motif Structures. And these photographs are from the Motif structures that were built by the Madan people of the Arab community in southern Iraq. Built entirely with bundled reed or reed in the form of woven in the form of mats. And it creates these incredibly beautiful, large ceremonial spaces for people to meet, eat together, dine together, and have hospitality. So this is a very important aspect of southern Iraqi landscapes for particularly large tribal gatherings, weddings, funerals, and so on. So similar representations of such reed structures. What's really exciting is that you find similar kinds of reed structures represented in ancient Mesopotamian artifacts, and that these are associated with the cult of Inanna. We're going to see some of those examples, and that's a really interesting feature of this ecology and this adaptation and this kind of the use of this architectural material is really transhistorical, used for very different purposes, but still architectural technologies that are used is really quite interestingly similar. This landscape of motif structures were then kind of really placed on these what are called turtlebacks or little islands, that you would move between them using boats. It's really quite a fascinating landscape, and I'd like you to imagine actually that the recent work by archaeologists have shown that those first major Bronze Age cities in southern Mesopotamia really flourished in this kind of very watery landscape. It's fascinating because we really thought that they were, for a long time, we thought that these were kind of rather dry landscapes that had to be irrigated. But the first urban environments we're going to see, like Uruk or Eridu or Nippur, these are very close to these kind of marshy landscapes. I'd like to share with you this important sketch from Nicholas Postgate's Early Mesopotamia, Society and Economy at the Dawn of History. That's a really interesting book that we could use. You could use if you are studying anything about this kind of early Bronze Age Mesopotamia. And I love this sketch very much because it's a diagram that shows us how the river and its environment was used by Mesopotamians in setting up their villages and their fields and setting up irrigation, right? And grazing their animals. So on the left, you're seeing a drawn sort of diagram with a section on top and a plan in the bottom. On the left, you're seeing the river, right? You see the river, so the village is actually, notice where the village is. The village is not located on the river itself, but on a canal that is a man-made canal that is built off the river, right? And so Chicago River, as you know, if you know Chicago really well, Chicago River has also have these really lots of canals that are used for transportation, for transport of water, and for infrastructure within the city. Just like that, Mesopotamians were using this water. And also, if you actually live next to the river, you're exposed to flooding of the river. So if you don't want to experience the flooding of the river, you set yourself in control of a smaller canal, in which you can actually use weirs and little dams to actually control the flow of water. And then you can just open smaller channels and different canals, irrigation canals, to actually take the water out into the fields and all the way to the outskirts of habitation where pastoralism takes place. That's where you take your animals for grazing. And so you can see this kind of environment sort of really working really well for the Mesopotamians. And you see on the right, you see one of those canals opened, these kind of irrigation canals opened by Iraqis in southern Iraq and surrounded with palm trees, date palm, actually. And this image, this is another interesting map of the Middle East that I wanted to share with you. It actually shows this long history of human interference and manipulation of irrigation of the two rivers. If you look carefully, the small red and white rectangles are actually the hydroelectric dams that were built on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and their branches and their tributaries in the 20th century. And so you can see these rivers come actually out of the mountains in Turkey, and then they flow into Syria and Iraq eventually. And of course, because the water is moving from the sources in Turkey towards the Persian Gulf, because of these dams, it's continuously losing water. So this becomes a very important political conflict between these three countries. How are they going to share and use the river, the waters of the river? And so it's often a very sort of antagonistic relationship in terms of the use of these rivers, because all three countries really decided to build multiple dams along the Tigris and the Euphrates River. So there's a very interesting political ecology of water that is taking place in this landscape, and we have to be aware of this. So southern Mesopotamia is very different today, mainly because of this kind of infrastructure projects that have completely altered the water regime for this kind of river system. In the last two slides, I'd like to talk about how scientific work is helping us understand the history of landscapes a lot better in this region, particularly the help we're getting in environmental sciences. One example that there are many of these different methodologies, different techniques, different fields of research, but one of those which is very important in my perspective for us to understand the history of landscapes, history of regions, is palinology and paleobotany. Sometimes it's called paleoethnobotany. These are paleo-environmental sort of branches which looks at really climate and vegetation history of particular regions by using the pollen record from freshwater lakes. So what happens is that every year the pollens from the trees land on the surface of freshwater lakes, and those pollens gradually sink into the bottom of the lake, creating, if you imagine, thousands of years of accumulation of these pollens, this kind of organic material in the bottom of the lake. What the scientists do is, you see the two scientists on the left, they take this core, these cores through the lake bottoms, which actually create a substantial and enormous stratigraphy, layering of thousands of years of an archive of vegetation history. So you can tell actually how different how vegetation is changing over the years, how climate is changing, how the level of water is changing throughout these years. You can even tell deforestation, the human impact. Like if, let's say, the Assyrian Empire is cutting trees from the cedar forest, you will see it in the pollen diagrams. It's very, this is a very important body of information that's actually coming. And on the chart on the left, you're seeing how spruce tree, ash trees, elm trees, oak trees, grasses, and how these different plants are actually going up and down through thousands of years. And so you can see the big trends in the history of those vegetations. And so, and finally, in this last section, in this last slide, is about satellite imagery, about the use of satellite imagery in the study of landscapes, in the study of the history of landscapes. So these satellites, these are military satellite imagery that were declassified in the last several decades and open to public use and academic use. These are high-resolution satellite images that were taken in the earlier part of the 20th century, and they were gradually declassified and now being used by archaeologists to actually look at these images and identify archaeological sites, archaeological features like roads, water canals, and all kinds of features in the landscape that you cannot really see very easily when you're on the ground. And so what I'm showing you is a 1967 corona image taken by the corona satellite, showing actually that rectangle in the middle of the image is actually the Assyrian city of Nineveh, with the little Kuyunjuk Mound on the lower left, and the nearby city of Mosul on the right. And so you can see how much you can actually, this is one site, how much actually you can see, how much detail you can see in this one satellite image. And so archaeologists take these images, and the important thing is also it's 1967, right? A lot of these earlier 20th century, 1950s, 1960s, these images carry information that are not actually accessible anymore because of those massive changes, infrastructure changes in the landscape. The industrialization of agriculture has changed these landscapes dramatically. So these images allow us access these kind of pre-industrial sort of countryside, what it looked like. And you can identify aspects of this landscape and then go do ground truthing to see what you're seeing in the image is actually a thing. And so this is another very important tool that archaeologists are increasingly used in the field. So thank you very much. In the second video, we're going to talk about the Chalcolithic cultures in the Middle East.